there is something worth sitting with before we begin. Think of the last time you tasted chocolate. The particular weight of it on the tongue, the way it softens at the edges of warmth before giving way entirely. It is one of the small, reliable pleasures of modern life, available in every airport, in every supermarket, in the pockets of children on 6 continents. We reach for it without ceremony, without thought, the way we reach for anything that has always simply been there. Now ask yourself, where did it come from? Not the factory, not the brand, not the wrapper with its mountain imagery and its promises of purity. Where did the cacao bean begin its journey? In whose hands, under whose sky, in what particular quality of morning light? For nearly half of all the chocolate consumed on Earth, the answer is the same. It began here, in a country that most of the people eating that chocolate could not find on a map, in a land that is, in the most precise sense, essential to the daily lives of billions, and almost entirely invisible to them. This is what it means to be indispensable without being seen, to labor at the center of a global system and to remain, from the perspective of that system, peripheral. The thread connects. The names do not travel with it. That country is Ivory Coast. And before we can understand what it is, we have to learn how to look at it honestly, which is to say, without the comfortable distance that consumption allows. Ivory Coast covers 322,463 square kilometers in the southern bulge of West Africa, bordered by Ghana to the east, Burkina Faso and Mali to the north, Guinea and Liberia to the west, and the Gulf of Guinea to the south. It is roughly the size of New Mexico, or Italy, or Poland. Those comparisons are useful for a moment. Then they become a distraction, because the story of this land is not told by its dimensions. A country can be large and empty, or small and inexhaustible. What defines Ivory Coast is not the space enclosed within its borders, but the extraordinary compression of forces packed within that space. Geological, ecological, climatic, human. Forces that have been in constant negotiation for centuries, and that continue, even now, to produce outcomes the world receives without understanding. To know this country, you have to begin where geography begins, with the land itself in its full, unmediated character. Not as backdrop, but as protagonist. Because in Ivory Coast, the environment is not a setting in which history happens. It is one of the principal actors. Begin at the edge, begin at the water. The southern coast of Ivory Coast meets the Atlantic Ocean, and the Atlantic here does not behave the way it behaves in tourist brochures. There are no calm bays, no gentle waves lapping at pale sand, while holidaymakers recline in the middle distance. The surf lines along the Ivorian coast are long, powerful, and in many places genuinely lethal. The undertow is among the most treacherous in West Africa. The ocean does not invite, it arrives with force, it pulls with purpose. It has claimed lives with a regularity so consistent that coastal communities have built their entire relationship with the sea around this fact, around the knowledge that the water is powerful, and that power is not theirs to assume. Fishing on these waters is not recreation, it is not sport. It is a negotiation conducted daily with something that could kill you, by people who have no alternative economy to fall back on. The boats are narrow, the currents unpredictable, and the decision to push out before dawn is made not in the presence of ideal conditions, but in the acceptance of necessary risk. The men who fish this coast understand something about the nature of existence that is difficult to articulate from the inside of a life where danger is optional. They go out anyway, every morning, not because the sea is kind, but because it is there, and because life requires it of them. There is a philosophy in that, if you let yourself feel it. A way of being in the world that does not wait for conditions to improve before proceeding. That looks at something enormous and indifferent and says, I must engage with this. I must find a way. Move inland from the coast, through the lagoon systems and the mangrove channels, and you enter what was, for most of recorded history, one of the great tropical forests of West Africa. The operative word is was, the forest that once covered the entire southern half of this country, dense and layered and biologically extraordinary, home to forest elephants and chimpanzees, and hundreds of plant species found nowhere else on Earth now covers less than a quarter of its original area. Say that again, slowly, because it deserves not to be absorbed quickly. Within a single human lifetime, within the memory of people still alive, more than 3/4 of one of West Africa's great ancient forests was destroyed. Not degraded, not thinned, destroyed, cleared. Converted from something that had taken millennia to assemble into farmland and timber, and the raw material of a global commodity system that never once paused to ask what it was consuming. Two forces drove this transformation: cocoa farming and logging. They are typically presented as villains in narratives about tropical deforestation, and in a narrow accounting, that framing has some accuracy. But it misses the deeper story. It misses the farmer who stood at the edge of his family's land, looking at the trees, and understood perfectly well what he was about to do. And did it anyway, not out of ignorance or malice, but out of the specific, pressing logic of poverty, meeting a global commodity system that rewarded destruction and charged nothing for it. The forest fell because people needed to eat, because a child's hunger is more immediate than a forest's future, because when the international market placed a price on cacao and placed no price on biodiversity, the rational choice, the only choice available to people without other options, was to plant. We should not sentimentalize the trees at the expense of the people who cleared them, but we should be precise about the system that made clearing them the only available path forward. What remains of the original forest is still remarkable. The Tai National Park in the southwest, a UNESCO World Heritage Site, contains one of the last significant fragments of the Upper Guinean forest, a biological treasure of global importance, held in a state of constant pressure by the agricultural land that surrounds it on every side. The chimpanzee populations inside Tai have been studied by primatologists for decades. They are among the most scientifically documented animal communities in the world. They use tools, stones cracked against roots to open hard-shelled nuts, leaves shaped into sponges for drinking. They have distinct cultural practices that vary between communities, traditions passed between generations that differ by group, the way that dialects differ between neighboring villages. They are, in certain technical senses, more closely observed and more carefully understood than the farming communities living alongside them. That sentence is worth sitting with. The animals inside the protected boundary have been the subject of scientific papers, international research grants, documentary films, and decades of careful attention. The farming families outside that boundary have been the subject of considerably less interest to the institutions of the global scientific community. This is not an accusation. It is a fact offered without drama, as a small lens through which to examine whose lives a particular kind of knowledge economy considers worth documenting, and what that reveals about whose existence is treated as meaningful, as data worth collecting, as a story worth telling. Cross the invisible line into the northern half of the country, and you enter an entirely different world. The forest gives way to savanna, the Sudanian zone, and everything changes. The air changes, the scale changes, the light changes. What you gain in horizon you lose in shelter, and the sky here is not decorative. It is enormous, active, and present in the life of everything beneath it in ways that city skies are not. This is rolling grassland cut through by rivers that swell enormously in the wet season and shrink to threads in the dry. This is land that teaches patience through seasonality, that structures agriculture around the rhythm of abundance and scarcity, in a pattern people have read and responded to for generations. Between November and March, the harmattan arrives. It comes from the Sahara, this wind, a dry, dusty presence that drops temperatures at night, coats every surface in fine particulate matter, turns the sky a pale and milky yellow, and gets into food and lungs and eyes and the pages of books left open on a table. The harmattan is not a meteorological event in the way that a storm is an event, something that begins, peaks, and ends. The harmattan is a season, a presence, a fact of life that restructures everything it touches, from agriculture to health, to the texture of daily experience. People who have never lived through a harmattan tend to think of wind as something that passes. Those who know the harmattan understand that some presences do not pass. They settle. They become part of the year's character. You plan around them. You adapt. You develop a relationship with something you cannot control and cannot escape, and that relationship shapes you in ways you do not always notice, because they have become so thoroughly ordinary. Between the forest south and the savanna north lies a zone that resists easy description, geographically ambiguous, culturally hybrid, agriculturally productive, in ways that have drawn people to it across centuries and continue to draw them still. This is some of the most fertile land in the country. It is also some of the most contested. In the international imagination, conflict in Africa tends to be either invisible or spectacular, either entirely below the threshold of notice, or dramatic enough to generate brief, intense coverage before attention moves elsewhere. The land disputes of Ivory Coast's transitional zone belong to the first category. They are quiet, they are chronic, they involve farming communities, migrant workers, questions of indigenous tenure, and customary ownership and formal title that do not resolve cleanly along any single axis. They have been producing low-grade, high-consequence tension for decades. These conflicts do not announce themselves. They do not produce the imagery that draws cameras. They produce, instead, a particular kind of ordinary suffering. Disputes that reshape lives, displace families, determine the futures of children, while remaining entirely below the line of international legibility. This is worth naming, not because naming it resolves it, but because the alternative, the silence in which these conflicts continue, is itself a kind of violence, a secondary erasure layered on top of the primary one. The climate throughout is merciless in its own precise ways. The South operates on 2 wet seasons and 2 dry seasons, a rhythm that agricultural communities have organized their lives around for centuries. The rains, when they come, do not arrive gently. They arrive as walls of water, sudden and total, flooding streets not designed for them, overwhelming drainage that was inadequate when it was built and has not improved since. The red laterite soil turns in rain into a surface of extraordinary treachery, swallowing motorcycle wheels, undermining building foundations, making the ordinary logistics of daily life into a physical negotiation that must be renegotiated every wet season from the beginning. The heat in the South is constant, humid, adhesive, the kind of heat that makes the air feel solid, that produces in long-term residents a relationship with shade that borders on the spiritual. The North offers a different heat, dry, direct, unmediated by moisture, a heat that bakes rather than steams. Both are serious, neither is metaphorical, and what both versions of this climate produce, what this land, in all its extreme and competing geographies, has consistently produced, is people who negotiate difficulty as a fundamental practice, who do not wait for conditions to become hospitable before proceeding with the work of living, who have built civilizations across these extreme and competing geographies, cultures, traditions, languages, systems of knowledge and relationship and belief that the world has consistently underestimated, not because those civilizations are small, but because the world has not looked. A land shapes its people, but a people shape their cities. And cities are where the dreams and contradictions of nations stop being invisible, where they become visible in concrete and glass, in boulevard and ruin, in the distance between what was imagined and what was built, between what was promised and what was lived. We have traveled the length of this country in its natural form, through the surf and the forest, through the harmattan wind and the red laterite mud. We have seen what the earth here demands of those who live upon it. Now we descend from the elemental to the human, from geology to politics, from the ancient rhythms of rain and drought to something far more recent and far more fragile, the attempt to build a nation. Ivory Coast has 2 cities that carry its identity in completely different ways, for completely different reasons. Together they tell the whole story of what this country is and what it was trying to become. The first city is Yamoussoukro, the official capital, the city that almost no one visits. It sits at the geographic center of the country, reachable from Abidjan by a 4-lane highway that cuts through the forest with the confidence of a country that believed, once, that infrastructure was destiny. You drive for hours through green, and then, without warning, the forest gives way to something that does not belong here, or rather, to something that belongs nowhere on earth, quite as strangely as it belongs here. The avenues are wider than the Champs-Élysées. They are immaculate. The streetlights function. The medians are perfectly maintained. The road markings are fresh. And the streets are nearly empty. Not quiet empty, in the way that a town empties at noon when everyone moves inside from the heat. Empty in a more fundamental, more disquieting way. As if the city were waiting for inhabitants who made a different choice, who decided at the last moment to stay somewhere else, who never arrived. This is what it looks like to build a metropolis before the people come. To create the infrastructure of a great city, the boulevards, the roundabouts, the conference halls, the hotels, the presidential palace with its sacred crocodile lake, and to discover that infrastructure alone cannot summon life, that a city is not built, it grows, and growth cannot be commanded, even by those who believe they can command everything. What kind of ambition mistakes the vessel for the life inside it? What does it mean to build a capital city and then wait, for decades, for the capital to begin to feel like one? The decision to move Ivory Coast's capital to Yamoussoukro was made by one man. It was made for one man's reasons. His name was Félix Houphouët-Boigny. He governed Ivory Coast for 33 years, from independence in 1960 until his death in 1993. And his biography and his country's biography are so thoroughly entangled that separating them requires a kind of deliberate effort. The effort of remembering that nations and their leaders are not the same thing, even when a leader wills them to be. Yamoussoukro was his birthplace, his village, the place where his family's power was rooted, where his ancestors were buried, where the soil remembered him before he became what he became. Transforming it into a capital city was not urban planning. It was biography rendered in concrete and tarmac. It was the act of a man who had spent his career translating personal will into national fact, and who saw no reason to stop at the level of economics or diplomacy or agriculture, who wanted the land itself to confirm what he already knew about his own importance. This is not a small impulse. It is, in fact, one of the oldest impulses in the history of power. Rulers have always wanted to write themselves into geography. They have always wanted to build something that will outlast them, something that will make the abstract fact of their authority legible in stone. The pyramids are this impulse. The Forbidden City is this impulse. Versailles is this impulse. Houphouët-Boigny was not unique in wanting to leave a mark. What is worth examining is not the desire itself, but what it cost, and what it says about the nature of power that does not know how to distinguish between the personal and the public, between what the leader wants and what the nation needs. He was not a simple man. No figure who holds power for 33 years in a country as complicated as this one is simple. He presided over what was genuinely called an economic miracle. He maintained a stability that his neighbors often could not. He was pragmatic in ways that sometimes looked like wisdom, and sometimes looked like collaboration with forces that did not have his country's interests at heart. Post-independence leaders across Africa inherited impossible situations, the need to build a nation fast, to make something visible, to prove that independence was real and not merely a formality dressed in a new flag. Yamoussoukro was proof, but proof for whom? Nothing in Yamoussoukro prepares you for what stands at its center. Nothing in West Africa prepares you for it. Almost nothing on earth prepares you for it. The Basilica of Our Lady of Peace is, by the measurement that matters, the area enclosed beneath its dome, the largest church in the world. It is larger than St. Peter's Basilica in Rome, which it was explicitly designed to surpass. The marble was imported from Italy. The stained glass was made in France, and it is extraordinary, luminous, the color of old prayers made physical and transparent. The structure seats 7,000 people inside, and can accommodate 11,000 more on its esplanade. It was completed in 1989. Its cost has been estimated at $300 million, in a country where millions of people were living on less than $1 a day. Pope John Paul II consecrated the basilica in 1990. He reportedly asked, before doing so, that a hospital be built alongside it. A small clinic was eventually constructed. The gesture was noted. The gap between the clinic and the basilica was also noted. How do you hold this building in your mind? How do you judge it? The simplest response is outrage. And outrage is not wrong. $300 million. A country with inadequate hospitals and schools and roads. The arithmetic is brutal and does not need much elaboration. But the simple response does not fully account for what the building actually is. Because the Basilica of Our Lady of Peace is not merely extravagant. It is, in some sense, that resists easy dismissal, genuinely awe-inspiring. To stand inside it is to experience something that monumental architecture, at its rarest and most technically accomplished, can produce in a human body, a sudden, involuntary awareness of scale, of the smallness of the self, of something larger. Monumental architecture has always been the language of rulers who wanted to speak to history, rather than to the living. The living are inconveniently mortal. They have needs. They have opinions. History is more patient. History can be addressed in marble and glass and dome measurements that exceed Rome's. The question the Basilica forces is not a comfortable one. Is this hubris or devotion? Is it from the poor or a gift to posterity? Can it be both? Can something be simultaneously an act of profound faith and a profound misallocation of resources that a suffering population desperately needed? The answer the building gives, by continuing to stand, by drawing pilgrims, by simply existing in its impossible, luminous enormity, is that these questions do not resolve. They coexist. The contradiction breathes inside the dome, and there is something almost appropriate about that. A building that contains the whole country's central contradiction between the grandiose vision and the daily reality, made permanent in marble. Then there is Abidjan, and Abidjan is something else entirely. Abidjan is not a planned city, it is a lived one. It was not designed to impress history. It grew because life demanded it, because people arrived from every direction, and from every part of the country, and from every neighboring nation, and built something that no single mind could have conceived and no single will could have controlled. It sits on a lagoon system of extraordinary beauty, a city of bridges and water and glass towers rising above a chaos of red rooftops and markets, and mosques and churches and food stalls and taxi parks, and the perpetual motion of 10 million people who are always in the middle of something. It has been called the Paris of West Africa, a title it has complicated feelings about, partly because the comparison flatters, and partly because the comparison colonizes, because it measures an African city by how much it resembles a European one, which is not, finally, a useful way to understand either city. The Plateau District rises on its own peninsula, glass skyscrapers, banking headquarters, the skyline of a city that once believed, with genuine justification, that it was becoming one of the great financial centers of the continent. In the 1970s, at the height of the Ivorian miracle, that belief was not mere delusion. Abidjan was booming. The future felt like something you could touch. The markets of Adjamé exist in a different dimension from the plateau's glass and aspiration, a dimension of color and noise and commerce, so dense and so layered that moving through it is less like walking and more like navigating a living organism that is constantly reorganizing itself around you. Cloth and electronics and vegetables and spare parts and phone credit and grilled meat and conversation and argument and laughter, all of it simultaneously, all of it without pause. The music here is coupé décalé, a genre born in Abidjan's clubs in the early 2000s, urban and sharp and ironic, a sound that emerged partly from exile and partly from defiance, a music that refused to be solemn about suffering, that chose instead to dance with it. There is a philosophy in that choice. There is something specifically Abidjanese about it, the city's refusal to be defined entirely by its difficulties, its insistence on pleasure and style and rhythm, even when the circumstances argue against all three. At dusk, the street food appears. Atieke, fermented cassava, light and slightly sour, served with grilled fish, and the smell of charcoal and chili and salt air from the lagoon. People eat standing, moving, talking, the city at its most fundamentally itself. The miracle was real. In the 1960s and 1970s, Ivory Coast was the fastest growing economy in sub-Saharan Africa. Cocoa and coffee prices held. Foreign investment arrived. Infrastructure was built. The country was held up by development economists, by Western governments, by the international financial press, as a model of what post-colonial Africa could achieve. And it was not simply propaganda. Growth was happening. Cities were being built. Schools were opening. Life expectancy was rising. But the miracle rested on foundations that were never as solid as they appeared. It rested on commodity prices staying high. It rested on the personal authority of one man whose ability to hold competing interests together was real but also irreplaceable, which meant the moment he was gone, the whole system of management he had substituted for institutional development would begin to fail. A miracle, it turned out, had been built on two assumptions: that prices would always rise, and that a single man's will could substitute for the slow, difficult work of building institutions that outlast individuals. The 1980s arrived with commodity price collapses and structural adjustment programs and debt mounting faster than it could be serviced. And then Houphouët-Boigny died in 1993, and the succession that followed was everything that 33 years of consolidated personal power produces when the person at the center is no longer there. Contested, destabilizing, and eventually violent. The concept of Ivory emerged in the 1990s, a nativist ideology that began drawing legal and political distinctions between those deemed authentically Ivorian and those considered migrants or northerners, even those whose families had lived and worked and died in this country for generations. It was the politics of scarcity wearing the costume of identity. It was the old question, who belongs, being answered in ways that excluded and antagonized and ultimately fractured. The first civil war began in 2002. The country split roughly along north-south lines, a division that had economic and ethnic and religious textures, all tangled together in ways that resisted clean narration. Abidjan bore the shock. Streets that had been arteries of commerce became uncertain, dangerous. The country that had been a beacon of stability in West Africa fractured with a speed that stunned the region. No single story accounts for it. The causes were layered, the blame distributed, the suffering shared across lines that did not map cleanly onto any ideology or any simple accounting of grievance. What can be said is that the fracture revealed what the miracle had never resolved. The questions about belonging, about land, about who the country was actually for. Ivory Coast stabilized after 2011. The recovery that followed is, by the numbers, one of the most significant economic rebounds in recent African history. GDP growth returned. Infrastructure investment accelerated. The skyline of Abidjan rose again, new glass joining old concrete, cranes visible on the horizon in a city rebuilding its confidence. And yet, the cocoa farmer in the west of the country still receives roughly 6% of the final value of the chocolate his labor produces. The deforestation continues, slower now, subject to more regulation, the object of more international concern, but continuing. The land disputes in the transitional zone between the forest and the savanna remain largely unresolved, a slow pressure that has not dissipated. The people who moved through the country for generations, farming land they did not legally own in a system that needed their labor, but not their belonging, still live inside a legal uncertainty that no political settlement has adequately addressed. Recovery is not the same as resolution. A country can grow its economy while leaving its foundational contradictions untouched. A skyline can rise while the ground beneath it remains contested. Statistics can improve while the distance between those at the top and those at the bottom stays roughly what it was. This is not a failure unique to Ivory Coast. It is the condition of most of the world's economies. Simply more visible here, less disguised by the accumulated wealth that softens the edges of inequity elsewhere. There is a child eating an orange at dusk on a street in Abidjan. She is standing beside a woman who sells things from a low table: batteries, phone credit, small sachets of water, the kind of commerce that fills every empty meter of pavement in a city that never fully stops. Behind them, a billboard advertises a Swiss chocolate brand in bold European lettering. The chocolate was made from cocoa grown in the forest that used to be west of here. The billboard does not mention this. Next to the billboard, a gutter runs along the edge of the road, and the gutter needs repairing, has needed repairing for some time, and will probably need repairing for some time more. From a church 2 buildings away, music is coming, big music, full of voices and rhythm, and something that sounds like joy insisting on itself in the face of everything that makes joy difficult. People are moving in every direction. The air smells of grilled fish and exhaust and rain that has not yet arrived. This is Ivory Coast. Not a problem, not a miracle, not a symbol, not a lesson, a place. Specific, complicated, alive in all the ways that specific and complicated places are alive. Fully, contradictorily, and with a vitality that does not require outside witness to be real, even if outside witness has been, for too long, withheld. Billions of people have held this country in their hands without knowing it, have tasted it, enjoyed it, moved on. The land endures, the forests diminish, the cities grow, the questions remain open. The people, as they always have, negotiate. The world has not looked closely enough, but the world can start. If this history moved you, if this country, once invisible, now feels present, share this film. Leave a comment. Tell us where you're watching from. And subscribe, because the world is full of places like this. Essential, overlooked, and worth the time it takes to finally see